Hello and welcome to Black & Veatch's Asset Resiliency in Critical Weather Events webinar. I'm Becca Schmidt of Black & Veatch's Global Renewable Energy Business, and with me today I've got three panelists: Rob Wilhite, Senior VP and Managing Director for Global Distributed Energy at Black & Veatch. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Becca.
We've got Stephanie Veatch, Associate VP and Client Director for our water business at Black & Veatch. Hello, Stephanie.
Hello, Becca.
And Hua Feng, a Managing Director with Black & Veatch's Management Consulting business. Hi, Hua.
Hey, Becca.
So we've been seeing extreme weather events become more common occurrences. And in recent years, the United States has experienced more hurricanes, wildfires, and Arctic winter conditions that have created significant impacts to critical human infrastructure and eroded confidence in the resilience of these systems. And as a result, elected officials, consumers, and other economic stakeholders are demanding utilities to take more forward-looking approaches to operations and capital expenditures to ensure the resiliency of their assets during these crises. In this webinar today, we're going to focus on the recent events in Texas. So as you all probably have heard, less than 2 weeks ago, the combination of sub-freezing temperatures forced the largest power outage in US history. The storm left millions without electricity and millions more facing severely disrupted water services as outages, and some of which continue today. And these events have crippled critical infrastructure systems throughout the state. But Texas is only part of the story. California, Florida, and the Gulf Coast region, Colorado, New York, and the Mid-Atlantic. No region has been untouched by conditions as far-ranging as extreme heat, cold, drought, rain, or ice. I'm fortunate that today I'm joined by experts who can discuss opportunities for infrastructure service providers to understand what is impacting their systems, offer implementation scenarios to combat the economic, psychological, and humanitarian impacts of extreme weather, and build greater resilience and reliability within these essential systems. So let's go ahead and get started with who is affected by extreme weather events from an ownership perspective. Rob?
Thank you, Becca. Pleased to be here today, first of all. I would say that for the sake of this conversation that we'll have today, we can focus on critical infrastructure such as electricity, natural gas supply, water and wastewater, but there are other certainly not less important critical assets such as public health systems, safety systems, telecommunications. But for the sake of conversation, let's stick to electricity, gas, and water for today. And, like the broader U.S., electricity really powers the Texas economy. And of course, Becca, you stated that this event recently in the last 2 weeks occurred across multiple locations in the U.S., not just Texas. But if you think about the impact of electricity to Texas, it is a common thread to all the infrastructure types that I just identified. In fact, there's this great codependency of natural gas and water distribution that not only relies on electricity supply in order to make that distribution more effective, but electricity is also generated from natural gas. And in fact, it goes to supply a great amount of the distribution and treatment of water facilities. And we'll hear more from Stephanie about that. But the codependency, I think, is an important point, and we'll talk about that throughout the course of today's conversation. But those are the three, I think, that are going to come into play for the owners. The owners in this case being residential customers, commercial and industrial establishments, certainly critical loads like healthcare, hospitals, public safety, as I referenced earlier. And we'll look forward to further discussion among these infrastructure types.
Given that all infrastructure classes are at risk from weather extremes, what are some of the steps that an owner can take to evaluate the assets they own and increase their resilience?
Sure. Happy to start the response to that, Becca. One thing that became very apparent early on during the situation in Texas 2 weeks ago was the lack of firm commitments for natural gas supply for a lot of the power plants. And that also applied to certain other types of industrial customers. And having interruptible type gas supply is certainly less expensive in terms of sourcing of natural gas fuel. And at the time when the pipelines were unable to move a high volume or sufficient volume of gas, priority was given to residential facilities and others in terms of the availability of the limited amount of gas supply. So there's a market incentive mechanism here that comes into play as to whether or not those who own and operate natural gas power generation facilities have firm enough contracts in order to guarantee they'll have the gas supply to convert to electricity. The other aspect is to harden infrastructure assets. Those who own, for instance, wind turbines can take steps and measures to be able to enable those wind turbines to operate in very cold temperatures and to deal with ice and snow events. In fact, many of these wind turbines operate quite effectively in northern climates. They're just not geared for the hardening that it takes in order to operate in the conditions that Texas saw the last couple of weeks. In fact, just a couple of days ago, one of the owners of wind turbines in parts of Texas has actually stepped up and said that they're going to provide that hardening. And then finally, the press that has been coming out about the Texas and the ERCOT event specifically has mostly focused on the supply side. But if we look at the demand side and the use of distributed energy resources, that's the other half of this equation that we really need to emphasize and think about. And providing backup power generation at critical load centers and assets, providing the ability for consumers to tap into battery capacity in their electric vehicles that might be grid connected, or to even reduce load in order to help preserve the integrity of the power grid at times when that is necessary in lieu of actual blackouts. So we should also pay attention for the demand side. So Becca, back to you.
Stephanie, what are your thoughts from a water perspective on this question? What can owners in the water industry do to evaluate their assets and help increase resilience?
Sure. So there's a series of activities that water and wastewater owners can undertake, both in the short and in the long term. The first thing that owners can do is perform an independent post-event evaluation and develop a scorecard, if you will, of their utility's response to the recent events. And they can either do this independently, internally, or they can hire a third-party consultant such as Black & Veatch to support this post-event evaluation. Second, water and wastewater owners can update their risk and resiliency plans that they performed as part of America's Infrastructure Act. And so that's a good second step they can do. Thirdly, they can develop a winterization plan. And in terms of longer term activities, like Rob said earlier, owners can look at hardening their entire system, not just against extreme cold, but also flooding, hurricanes, cybersecurity, and other disruptive events. Lastly, there are alternate energy sources off the grid that owners can consider implementing in their cities or their utilities. Of course, all these activities need to be based on a structured risk-based decision-making process that weighs the cost to the consumer against the risk reduction that they're getting, so they make sure that they're getting appropriate value for their money. Thank you.
Wow, what's your take on this? What's your perspective on this question?
I agree with Rob and Stephanie's assessment of the steps that the owners can take in order to increase their resiliency. I think it's also crucial for the asset owner to start incorporating extreme weather events into their planning, risk management, asset integrity management, and other internal strategic process they undertake. The magnitude of this risk will have to be quantified to some degree, and proper mitigation strategy needs to be proposed, evaluated, and implemented. The mitigation strategy could include a suite of tools that at the owner's disposal that includes physical enhancement or improvement, backup redundancy equipment, insurance, or financial hedging instruments. the risk exposure to extreme climate event has also attracted the attention of the financial markets. The Financial Stability Board created the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, in order to improve and increase reporting of climate-related risks by companies who wish to participate in the financial markets. TCFD specifically requires that the companies report two types of risk related to climate. The first category is physical risk, and the second category is transition risk, which include regulatory risk, technology risk, legal risk, reputation risk, and commodity or service demand risk. So essentially, for infrastructure asset owners, a comprehensive approach towards risk management related to the extreme weather events might become the new norm for long-term planning.
Thanks, Hua, for your insights. Stephanie, I'm going to pitch this next question to you. What are some of the actions that utility owners can take in the short term as they map out their response and recovery following the recent extreme weather?
Sure. I think in the short term, the post-event response evaluation is a really great place to start. And these post-event evaluations can be done for any disruptive event. For instance, we perform them for owners with respect to their COVID response. Now, more recently, we are helping clients with doing these post-event evaluations in terms of the recent cold weather event that occurred. So the benefit of these assessments is they can be done very quickly. They could be done internally by an independent party that's reviewing the response to it. So they can be done quickly. It gives you a quick evaluation of how your utility performed, and it shows some of your gaps and also where you did well. This information is presented and used as a communication tool with your board members, your city council members, and your other stakeholders. So I think that's a great way to start.
Absolutely. Could you give us a couple of examples?
Sure. So one recent example is the post-event evaluation that we are performing for the San Antonio Water Systems, SAWS, where we're looking at the response time in this recent event to address failed equipment. So in their case, they do seem to have done a really good job. What they did is they immediately developed a protocol to take all of their disparate work crews that work on a variety of different things. They form them into rapid response units that were responsible for specific assets. And those crews were responsible for monitoring, reporting, and repairing of those specific assets. And that's one of the ways that they were able to quickly respond to failures in their system. And so that's an example of where we assisted a client to look at how their protocol had performed after the event, and they can take that information and update their protocol as needed for the next event so they can be more prepared.
Hua, do you have any examples or thoughts from a management consulting perspective?
Yes, and I think in the short term that the immediate action should always be review the response and identify some improvement that can be implemented or taken in the short term, such as improvement on personnel deployment, stakeholder communications, or the kind of in addition to the immediate steps that Stephanie mentioned, it is going to be applied to other sectors such as natural gas or electric utilities as well. Well, the other challenge I want to point out is that utilities might face a management of customer bill issues. We all know that because some of the costs that utilities incur to serve customers were tied partially to the spot market, and the market went through the roof during that fiscal week, so that there will be customers who are going to dispute their bills, and there are going to be customers who can't afford to pay the payment. So the financial consequence associated with the bill non-payment might be an issue that that the utility needs to carefully manage. And just as an example, if you have not looked at your utility bills for a natural gas bill, if you are not fixing your monthly bill payment, there is a line that's called gas cost adjustment, and on the utility bill, there's a line that's called fuel cost adjustment. That's the portion that actually are tied to the wholesale market price at the time. So, and I think that will be an consideration that utilities need to start thinking through and come up with strategies trying to manage through the process, maybe through a regulatory proceeding.
I'm going to go ahead and shift the conversation a bit to focus on the economic risks that the events in Texas and California exposed. So Brazos, one of the largest service providers in Texas, filed for Chapter 11 protection in early March. And this marked the second investment grade rated company since 2019 to declare bankruptcy in a short time span. As the other is California's PG&E, which sought Chapter 11 due to wildfire exposure. Do you see extreme weather events as an existential threat to other utilities? And if so, what can utilities do to avoid this? Rob, I'll throw this one to you first. I think you're on mute, Rob, which has happened to all of us during the COVID pandemic, working from home.
How many times have each of us said that phrase? You're on mute. Over
the limit does not exist.
No one's immune from it. But thank you for the question, Becca. Most definitely, utilities of all types are certainly being impacted by the intensity and increased frequency of storm events, be it the ones that you just named, wildfires, extreme summer events, winter events. Droughts are having an impact, certainly with water supply for power generation, and that's a big concern in the western part of the U.S. And I'm afraid to say that as we reflect back on what happened in Texas in the ERCOT market specifically 2 weeks ago, we may actually see further bankruptcies. And we're seeing significant financial stress as it applies to those who are part of the ERCOT footprint and even those who are not. This includes municipal-owned utilities, cooperatives like Brazos, retail energy providers who are in the competitive retail side of the industry, and perhaps even personal bankruptcies. As Wal was referencing, a lot of the significant bills that have increased during this short time period are starting to hit the inbox for a lot of customers, residential, commercial, industrial. And there are going to be significant surprises and the inability to pay some of those bills. During the course of the event, for a 4 or 5 day period, power costs in ERCOT rose 200 to 300 times the normal. And that the way the market works, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers in that scenario. Some of the power plant operators who are able to operate during that time frame, whether on gas or they had their wind turbines operational, they made significant revenue during the course of those 4 or 5 days, probably equal to what they would make an entire year. Those are the winners. On the loser side are those who had to pay to keep the lights on, or who were willing to pay the higher cost of power during that time frame. So the real question is, who's going to cover these costs? I believe currently there's a moratorium on shutting off electricity supply for lack of payment, and we've got to sort these situations out. But there is a true financial impact that may be in the billions of dollars that have to be allocated somehow. And so the question is, how are the market designs going to be adjusted accordingly? But, more importantly, in the short term, how are we going to cover these costs? And are they going to eventually come to all the eventual ratepayers in the ERCOT footprint? And I hate to say it further, but when you think about it, those who went without power for 3, 4, or 5 days may actually end up subsidizing those who actually had their power maintained during the course of those 4 or 5 days. So we have to look at the market construct, make sure we allocate these costs in a favorable manner, and that will continue to bear out over the coming days and weeks as we see the repercussions from the events 2 weeks ago. Becca?
Thanks, Rob. Wah, what are your perspectives on this? Do you have any additional thoughts on what utilities can do to avoid extreme weather threats?
As I mentioned earlier, I actually think that it is crucial that long-term planning should include extreme risks such as this. And for in regular or typical risk management metrics, we typically look at revenue at risk, cost at risk at a percentage level that has a 95% probability of coverage, which basically means that we are planning for the events that could happen with 5% probability. However, the event a couple weeks ago in Texas actually indicated that it might be prudent to plan for more extreme levels of risk exposure, such as 99%, which all you have to consider the situation where you have several risk drivers occurring at the same time that could significantly amplify the exposure that you may suffer through. And that requires sophisticated assessment of risk exposures, as well as understanding of what are the proper hygiene or risk management tools that you can implement to manage the risk exposure. And like Rob mentioned earlier, is that the ERCOT market structure currently does not allow for a proper mechanism to compensate utilities for planning for reserve margin or for adequate resource adequacy during peak time, just because by design, ERCOT market does not carry a capacity structure and does not have specifically require utilities have to carry or have firm contracts to meet a percentage of their load with firm generation capacity, so that we believe that and like a proper planning and structuring of some measure of resource adequacy measures should be considered in the utility planning scope. And we think that is going to be based on discussions with the other market participants and the regulatory bodies, what will be the proper mechanism to implement and recover cost associated with that.
So, Stephanie, the water industry, which is incredibly diversified and local in nature across Texas and most of the U.S., is going to have to take on a major capital improvement and system hardening program. So how can water utilities, whose rates are often very difficult to raise due to political realities and at the local level, make the types of investments that will be necessary to winterize their assets and provide additional resilience given their interconnection with the power grid?
That's a great question, Becca. Thank you for asking it. First, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of dependency between water and power, in that a lot of the challenges that water and wastewater owners faced in the recent events had to do with power resiliency. And so that's an issue that they'll have a stake in, but they don't directly have control over, but they can be influential. And Rob touched on that earlier in this discussion. However, that being said, there are also challenges associated with the resiliency of the water assets themselves, independent of any power issues. So in the water industry, we have assets prone to flooding, to cold weather, cybersecurity attacks, etc. And we do need to make improvements. And that often means raising rates, as you said, which is generally and historically been quite difficult, especially in Texas. Personally, I'm optimistic about it. I think the mindset of consumers is changing and evolving over time as they recognize the importance and the criticality of water. I think that the consumers also recognize that their risk profile may not be as willing to accept as much risk for low cost as they may have thought previously. We have seen plenty of cities within Texas that have done very well organized gradual rate increases over time that have been successful, and they've been able to do improvements to their systems. And I think we are going to continue to see more of that over time as water owners take a hard look at what risk their consumers are willing to live with and the trade-off that means for the rate increases. So some of the things that the owners can do to reduce the impact to the ratepayers is thinking about financing and alternative financing early in the planning process. This allows them to optimize the funding and even combine funding programs for the most efficient and cost-effective funding solution that minimizes the burden on the ratepayers. So owners can take advantage of a lot of grants and low interest programs, the loan programs that are out there. You've got FEMA that has grants, and some of our clients have already applied for FEMA funding as a result of this recent event. Texas Water Development Board with SRF fund is another great source. There's WIFIA. So some of them are either grants or they're loans that have a 5-year deferral, which is really great. With the WIFIA, your repayment stream can be sculpted to match the ratepayer needs. So I think it's a combination of things. The consumers, I think over time are going to become willing to accept some of these rate increases. And then the owners can reduce the impact of the rate increases by being really creative and forward thinking about their funding mechanisms.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, there was a great deal of confusion about what caused the grid failure. Increasingly, there's been a migration to renewable energy as electric utilities push to decarbonize. What does the situation in Texas, where renewables account for more than 1/4 of the state's electricity generation capacity and attracted some of the criticism about the outages, say about the overall visibility of energy from wind and solar, despite all of the positive media attention about DER? Rob, I'm going to throw this one to you.
Thanks, Becca. Appreciate it. At least I remember to unmute my mic here. First of all, I'll say that there's going to be a number of investigations that will unfold over the coming weeks and months. There certainly will be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and other federal agencies taking a deep look into what occurred in the ERCOT market specifically, even though they have limited regulatory jurisdiction in that market. There's also going to be some state investigations. And this is actually a very similar event to what occurred 10 years ago in 2011. And a report was generated by FERC back then. There's a question of whether or not the recommendations should have moved forward and been implemented, but we'll save that for another day. And, there is confusion, as you stated, Becca. And if you think about the underlying causes behind this, there were probably multiple contributing factors. Let's address first the high penetration of renewables. In a lot of cases, the renewables, such as the wind turbines I referenced earlier, were just simply not winterized to be able to operate in these cold conditions and under this kind of stress. Some of them still operated, and we still got a fair amount of wind generation and some solar for that matter. There are some who say and criticize that ERCOT should not have retired a lot of its coal generation because coal is a fuel that's available on site at the power plant. But yet, for those few coal plants still operating, their coal piles had frozen solid. So that created another set of issues. There's been some view of whether or not competitive retail market design has been effective. And if you think about how Texas has implemented that design, a number of retail customers have truly benefited from low prices and low costs for retail electricity, but recognizing in some cases they may not have been aware that they were on a variable rate design, whereas they're going to be getting some bills in the next week or two for thousands of dollars, but yet they've probably saved thousands of dollars over the course of several years based on having those low rates. So there's a sticker shock impact there. Some will say that the lack of interconnection of ERCOT to other wholesale power markets could have been a contributing factor and may have prevented some of the rolling blackouts. But this winter event impacted some of those connecting markets. And so whether or not those folks in SPP in Oklahoma or even in other parts outside of Texas and the ERCOT footprint may not have been able to supply sufficient electricity and energy into the ERCOT market because they were struggling to keep their grids up and running as well. And then finally, some have said that if ERCOT had a capacity market, there would be financial incentives for power generators to be in standby ready mode and maybe switch to firm contracts for natural gas supply for those power generators. Perhaps, but this is a market that has enabled power generators to make significant financial gains, during short-term events where the price escalates very rapidly in the wholesale markets. Whether or not they're reimbursed fully for those price incentives will remain to be seen over the coming weeks. The other aspect is some power plants were actually shut down for scheduled maintenance during the last couple of weeks, and that's normal as ERCOT is really a summer peaking market and geography. So this is something that is not uncommon, but it did result in some forms of power generation not being available. So if you pull all this together, really it was all forms of power generation that were subject to failures 2 weeks ago, including a nuclear unit, by the way. So you can't point to one type of generation or one fuel type as being the main culprit. I think there was multiple contributors to this extreme event. And, the one thing I'll say again, as I indicated earlier, there's been a lot of coverage to the power supply side of this equation, but, balancing a power grid is working both the supply side and the demand side. And it's on the demand side that I believe we're going to see greater focus in the near term. We'll see a renewed interest perhaps with backup distributed generation, customer-owned generation, and that could also include gen sets fueled by diesel or natural gas, but also on-site solar. And certainly demand response will certainly command some attention, perhaps even grid-connected electric vehicles and using the energy capacity in the batteries. And in fact, if you think about battery storage, Texas is actually home to some of the largest energy storage projects in the U.S., even though the T&D utilities and ERCOT are not permitted to own this technology. So I would say we need to look at both sides of the equation, both supply and demand, and not say that any one particular technology or aspect of the market was the main contributor to the situation 2 weeks ago. Becca?
Thanks, Rob, for painting a really clear picture of how widespread the effect of these events have been across generation and the grid system. So for our final question today, I'm going to give all of you the opportunity to respond to. This is the third major storm event in the past decade that has had a material impact on the Texas grid, one in 2011, one in 2014, and now in 2021. So obviously there's a lot of emotion on the ground in Texas right now, and it will manifest itself in various ways. Political pressure, shareholder pressure, economic and recovery efforts, these all create an appetite for action. How do asset owners right-size their responses to these events and optimize the balance between the risk reduction and costs? And do you have any sense on how likely it is that this time will be different than the other times and resiliency measures will get funded? Rob, you want to get in the hot seat first?
Sure, absolutely, Becca. I think the reality is that storm events like which occurred 2 weeks ago are likely to be the new normal for us. And we're going to see, as we talked about earlier in this program, there are more frequent events, be it winter, summer events, wildfire events, other types of threats to power and gas and water systems. And, we're going to be seeing those become more intense in the future. Look, we could turn the clock back, 30, 40 days prior to this event and say that, look, at that point, we didn't know specifically that the temperatures would get this extreme in Texas during this particular week in February. But what we did know and what we know today is that the risk of these types of events are likely increasing. If we just simply look at the NOAA or even the U.S. Department of Energy tracks storm events and the impact on outages and the scope of those outages, we see an increasing curve and indicating that we're going to see more of these events. So we know that that's coming, and that's going to continue to be a growing threat to infrastructure. In Florida specifically has been subject to more intense tropical storm activity, certainly over the past 10 to 20 years. And prior to that, there was always the threat, but it's been more intense and more frequent. In fact, I don't recall a hurricane season ever going into the Greek alphabet to name storms as we did last year. So in Florida, the policymakers said, look, enough is enough. A couple of years ago, they passed Senate Bill 796, called the Public Utility Storm Protection Plans. And it gave the regulated utilities the opportunity and the obligation to file storm hardening plans to make investments in their power infrastructure in order to try to first withstand some of the impacts of these major storm events, but also enable the utilities to recover more quickly after the events to get power back more rapidly to the citizens of Florida. And in fact, if you think about the economics and the trade-off here, if a wide portion of Florida loses electricity due to a major storm event, and this continues to occur over the last several decades, then the economic impact can be $1 billion a day or more in lost gross domestic product. So imagine that. Those are the economics we're dealing with here. So as we think about investment decisions, today we're mostly focused on, at least in these critical infrastructure industries, we're focused on reliability to a large extent. But what we have to consider is the longer term resiliency in terms of the costs and benefits. And in fact, on a personal basis, we all make those decisions every day when we consider personal insurance, for life insurance, for our vehicles, for our homes. Why not consider the additional long-term benefits associated with the costs for resiliency investments as an insurance in order to protect the infrastructure we're talking about today? Becca?
Thanks, Rob. Wah, what are your thoughts on this final question?
Well, I actually totally agree with Rob that change definitely are going to happen. And I think there should be a comprehensive assessment of the consequence from this very extreme events and the likelihood of them occurring. And some mechanisms have to be put in place to allow cost recovery for proper investment made to improve resiliency or resource adequacy. In a capacity market conference last December, the Texas model was compared against the other energy market, like in electric market in PJM, where utilities are required to pay a significant amount of capacity payments to generators in order to hold generation capacity levels higher than their peak load requirement. However, we know that in the PJM market, there are significant disagreement among market participants as to what is the competitive level of capacity price should be and how to deal with some states trying to subsidize the zero carbon capacities they want to put into their state's generation portfolio, such as nuclear or renewable capacity. And in comparison, Texas does not have a firm requirement for capacity, and it has an energy price cap of $9,000 per megawatt hours, which, by the way, have been reached several times during the 2 weeks ago. And if they were, the market structure is designed to use the $9,000 per megawatt hour of energy price as a financial incentive for the generators and to improve their infrastructure and bring their generation online during those peak times. However, what happened a couple of weeks ago demonstrated that this $9,000 per megawatt hour is not sufficient to provide enough incentive for generators to invest in winterization of their facilities, and it proves to be too low to account for the level of human suffering.
Thanks, Wah. Stephanie, you're the final person in the hot seat for today. What thoughts do you have from a water perspective on this question?
Sure, it's a great question. It's something that each owner needs to spend some time reviewing with their stakeholders to achieve the right balance between cost and risk reduction. So in the water industry, the OEA risk and resiliency assessments were a really good starting point. And for those of you who might not be familiar with that, that's America's Water Infrastructure Act that required all but the very small water and wastewater utility owners to conduct these risk and resiliency assessments. And so those have been occurring over the last couple of years. And those have been really helpful. And we are seeing that a lot of our clients are availing themselves of FEMA funding and putting resiliency programs in place. But a lot of those are just, or doing hardening for their facilities. But a lot of that work is just in its infant stages, and it has a lot more needs to be done before it's completed. And also, although I think the OEA work did help a lot of the water utilities to be more prepared for the recent events, the fact is that based on historical data in Texas, like my colleagues have said, the likelihood of a winter storm of this magnitude was really quite low. And so given the likelihood of occurrence, it may not have triggered actions for a lot of utilities. So they may have been focusing more on the flood events than they were on the winterization events or the extreme cold events. But again, as my colleagues have said, we can expect more extreme weather events in the future. I think the recent event should encourage utilities to go back and look at their assumptions and risk tolerance and decide how to update their plans. I think that the 2011 event could be a good starting point. Maybe you don't base your plan on the event that most recently occurred happening very frequently, but maybe the 2011 event is a good starting point. It would also be really good for owners to incorporate what they learned recently during the recent severe weather event into their emergency response plan. So water utilities had to develop an emergency response plan as part of OEA. And if that just sits on the shelf and isn't a living document, then it's really not very helpful. But if they were to go back and update those emergency response plans now when everything's fresh, then they can really benefit from some of the knowledge that they learned recently.
Absolutely. Well, thanks to the panel today, Rob, Stephanie, Wah, for joining us and giving us your specific insights on how we can provide improvements to our infrastructure moving forward and create a healthier and safer community that's prepared for our next encounter with a challenging winter event. To those of you who have tuned in today, if you have more interest on this subject, please reach out to schedule a one-on-one with any of the panelists or experts at Black & Veatch by going to bb.com/experts.